Rich, today we're sitting down with Greg Martin, a managing director and investment banker from my homeland up in Canada, and also a podcaster running the podcast Lifetime at Work. And today we jump around from two different subjects that are really important. One is, how should entrepreneurs be thinking about their future exit of their business? And then also on the other side, entrepreneurs that work within an organization and how we can make that the best environment for them.
And he shares with us some of the key metrics that need to be looked at with regard to financials on a weekly basis.
Yeah, I specifically loved, Rich, how do you control your supply chain, control your margin, and control your cash? Here's Greg Martin.
Hey, are you looking for a rewarding and profitable entrepreneurial opportunity? Consider owning a CertaPro painting franchise with a startup cost of $250,000 and an average franchise revenue of $1.8 million. CertaPro is a low-risk, high-reward investment. As a CertaPro franchise owner, you'll receive extensive training and ongoing support and have access to proven business models that have been successful for over 3 decades. Plus, you'll work with a team of highly dedicated professionals who are passionate about helping homeowners transform their spaces. Visit CertaPro.com/franchise to learn more about this exciting opportunity and start your journey towards financial success today.
Greg, welcome to the Entrepreneurs United podcast.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for joining us from north of the border. It's 2 against 1 here, Canada against US, between you and I against Rich. So really look forward to that conversation. Tell us a little bit more.
Residency, it's the other way though, John.
From residency, maybe, but I'm still a Canadian passport holder, so it still counts. Greg, tell us a little bit about who you are and tell our audience a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what you're most excited about these days.
So I'm an investment banker. That's what by trade, I started that right out of university or college. And what was interesting was I always had wanted to be an entrepreneur. I come from a family of entrepreneurs, which was something that I aspired to do at some point, but coming right out of university, I was like, I have no idea what I'm doing. Like I could not, there's no way if I ever started something, I'd just be lost. So I started in investment banking, which is intense. It's 100-hour weeks, basically, is what you can expect. And what was cool was I got to work with a lot of entrepreneurs. That's what my day was. It was trying to help them usually sell their business is usually what we would do. And that's what I do a lot now. And through that journey, though, I realized, oh my God, what am I doing? This is a lot. I've always wanted to be an entrepreneur. And so one day, it took a lot of days, but over time, I ended up starting my own business and leaving the world of investment banking and doing that. And today, I am back in the world of investment banking. It was a food business that I started, a restaurant, catering, office business, and it did not hold up in the pandemic. The pandemic was really challenging for us. And what was interesting all about that was going through that experience of starting my own business, having that happen, and now getting back and working with a lot of entrepreneurs back in investment banking. I've just become enamored with our careers, what we get out of them, why we do them. And so I have a podcast myself called Lifetime at Work, and that's what we talk about. I usually interview guests and just talk about your job, what you get out of it, why you do it, the fulfillment you have for it. Because I'm super pumped, to answer your question, about just getting a lot out of your job and what it really means and how you can love it.
Okay, fantastic. I look forward to diving deeper into that a little bit. But before we do, I guess if I had to sum up everything I just heard, right? Go to school, go into the investment banking business, right? And you go into that space and you're helping people sell their companies, and you do that for 7 years, I think it was, or so. And then you say, you know what? I'm helping all these people sell their businesses. Maybe I should just jump in this myself and become an entrepreneur and do it myself. And you go and you cut your teeth. Obviously, timing may have been an issue there a little bit, but you learned, I'm sure, some valuable lessons. And then you go back to the investment banking side of things, helping entrepreneurs again. What did you learn? That's got to be the number one question people are probably thinking about this is, okay, what did you learn from going from investment banking to being the entrepreneur back to investment banking that now helps the people you work with?
How hard it is. It's really hard being an entrepreneur. I found it anyways. It was really challenging because the world of it is so broad. It is so broad, the things you have to deal with, the things you have to think about. It is, whereas when you have a job, whether however corporate, it is so much more narrow in terms of here's my function and here's what I do. And I really get to focus on it. And that was my biggest challenge. And so now working with entrepreneurs, I've always been, and for a long time, a consultant trying to tell these entrepreneurs what to do. And I felt a little bit, full of it, frankly, and just trying to really give them advice and not having gone through it. So to have been in their shoes and to understand what they went through to build their business, I think it's so intangible. It doesn't even sound like that much when I say it out loud now, but it is. It was huge. It was huge for me to get that perspective. But what also happened was I also learned a lot of skills by being an entrepreneur, right? By going out and doing it, just because I did marketing and I was working with people in a different way. And I had to do like all these different things and put all these different hats that I never had done before. And so learning those skills just made me understand their businesses better, because I understood like how hard it is to make a sale, how hard it is to come up with the perfect product that someone's going to buy, and create a team that can support it and do all that. Like just all the things you need to do. Again, as a consultant to someone who's just giving advice, you never really see that. You never really get to know what it took and what it takes and what you actually have when you have an organization that really does all those key things.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was listening to another podcast recently, and they were talking about the venture capital side of investing. And they were talking about how they really are looking for former founders or former entrepreneurs for the VC firms because of that relative experience. They can relate to the founders or the entrepreneurs running their business. So they know what they're going through. And so I'm sure that experience provided a really good base of understanding and coming from it. So that's fantastic. So now today, I want to go to your podcast in a minute, because there's a lot of, we call them intrapreneurs, people that work within a company, but they're still entrepreneurial spirited. We have a ton of entrepreneurs that listen to this podcast. Rich is an entrepreneur himself, in a way, both entrepreneur and intrapreneur in his business. But right now, today, in your profession as an investment banker, what is the target group that you're working with specifically?
Yeah, so we're a Canadian based. We've got about 50 people, our team. Okay. It's called Origin Merchant Partners. And I would say that's where we specialize is in M&A. We do a bit of financing work, but our clients are typically across the board industry wise, and they would be typically are, call it 30 to 300 million of enterprise value of the business is typically who we work with. So it's not really small companies and not really big ones. We're somewhere in between, and they come to us for strategic advice. When you decide to sell your business, it is a big deal. You are monetizing your biggest asset. It is a unique thing that you're doing that you've never done before. You probably never otherwise will. So we get involved with that. We sometimes get involved very early, but then we get really active when it's kind of time to pull the trigger and find a buyer. So that's our bread and butter. That's what we do.
Okay. And does your firm do both buy side and sell side, and you focus on sell side?
We do a bit, honestly, but yeah, it would probably more helpful on the sell side, just in our snack bracket and our size of company that we're dealing with. If you're doing an acquisition and you're a $30 million company, it's pretty small. Like it's just a pretty small acquisition you're a lot of times you're not always buying super valuable assets. A lot of times you're buying people, and you really need to know those people, and you don't always need an advisor. You may need an advisor for certain components of it but not quite the same. Whereas when you're selling your company, to really maximize the value, to get out there and to know everyone in the industry, and I'll call it the broader industry that you need to get to maximize it, really becomes, I think, that much more important to have an advisor. And that's where we, again, just end up playing more. We also do financing work. So companies that do want to do an acquisition or do want to grow or build a new plant or whatever it is, we will help them with capital. And that process actually looks a lot like you're selling your business, you're selling a part of it. So
Sure. Okay. So in 10 years of doing investment banking, 7 prior and now about 3 now, what are some of the biggest lessons, if you were talking, and you are right now, to entrepreneurs, saying, if you ever want to sell your business, from all the people I've worked with, all the businesses and entrepreneurs, here are the couple of things you should be thinking about right now to eventually have the exit that you're looking for? What would those couple of things be?
Yeah, it's really unique to your business specifically, but obviously I think the very cardinal thing is, if you're a founder, you can't make the business totally rely on you. If you become super critical to that business and there's a risk that, hey, Joe, who's running the business, leaves and the business goes to zero, like that's just something that no one's really going to take. So you're trying to build an asset that is going to have really unique value. I think just the more uniqueness of your business, the better. And I know that's abstract, but again, it depends on your business. But to think through it, I do think it is super helpful when you're building a business to start thinking about, like, very early, even when you're making strategic decisions years and years before, is like, who are you? Who could you sell to? Because a lot of that sometimes determines the value. If you get into all these different business lines and you've got all these different types of products that don't relate, and no one would think about your business and want to buy it because of that, then it's probably not the best way to go about it. But if you can be super, almost more narrow and say, okay, we're like experts at this. If someone's going to get into this vertical, this industry, this whatever, they're really going to need to buy us or acquire us. I think that's really the best way to position your business. And you don't have to go make a wholesale changes. It's just when you're thinking about it in the back of your head and you're making these kind of important strategic decisions, which direction to go with your business, that can be a helpful lens to think through, okay, how can I be that much more unique? How can I really stand out? How can I make the assets that I have, the business I have, super valuable to someone else and build something that they can't?
Yeah, I had heard saying once that relates to exactly what you just said, which was the question you ask an entrepreneur is, who's your client? And inevitably their answer is, we target homeowners and B2B, these types of, and the real answer is, no, your client is who you're trying to sell your business to eventually. That's your client.
Right.
That's your ultimate client, right? There are certain people are going to generate revenue for your business, but the client you're trying to sell your business to is who you should have really in mind as you're building everything. So that was a cool saying that somebody had said to me once that really related to me is, are you preparing your business for that eventual client? And I'm sure you have a lot of situations too, where you get in a process with somebody to sell their business, and for one reason or another, it's not successful because, as you mentioned earlier, the founders too are relying on the business or whatever. What are a couple other maybe traps that you find that entrepreneurs have not prepared their business for exit when they get to that level?
I would say that the biggest challenge is that bankers will come up to you. I think in this day and age, there are private equity if you have a significant business, right? There are bankers, there are private equity firms, there are VC. There's lots of groups that are coming and saying, I'm going to loan you all this capital. I want to buy your business. What can we? You get approached a lot. 100%. And that makes you think that your business is really valuable and that it's worth a lot, but they don't know anything. Like those groups coming in, they've seen your website, they've heard an interview, they've scraped the internet, and they found something about you, and that's what they're basing it on. And so it's not a whole lot. And so I think the key thing is to not get too wrapped up in the value that they're throwing out there early, or that you think the business is worth. Because if you really want to sell your business for a certain set value, sometimes it just takes a long time. Like you do have to take a few kicks at the can to really understand. And what I think, if you know you have a lot of runway, i.e. you don't need to sell your business today, but you're thinking about it in the next, 5 years, 2 years, think about that it might take a bit of time to sell your business. Like it may take years, because you may go out and run a process and realize that you don't have the value. No one's willing to give you as much as you think the business is worth. And at that point, you're going to have a decision. Do I just take this value that I've been given, which is lower than I want, or do I stay in the business and make it that much better, listen to what they said about why I have a lower value than what I wanted, and really work on it? Because that's really hard to do. It is really hard when you've mentally hired a banker, you've put all the materials together, you've gone out, you've done everything, and then to not get the offer that you want, and then to psychologically say, okay, now I'm going to forget that and go back to running my business. It's really hard, and I've seen it so many times. But I also have seen some people just willing to wait, willing to continue working on their business, and it's worth waiting for, and it can really work out. So I think, again, it's not a one size fits all. That's not the case for everyone, but I think you do have to be willing to wait a little bit longer than you maybe initially expected, keep running your business. And so I think just having extra in the tank, having extra drive, energy, whatever in the tank when you go into a process is important.
Greg, you had said your sweet spot is between 30 million and 300 million, and you give those businesses strategic advice. Can you give an example of a big success that you've had when you've given strategic advice? It was a right advice, it was implemented, and it yielded a big success.
Yeah, I would say the strategic advice that we typically give is along those lines of positioning and relating to what you are trying to do on the monetization front, right? So I'm trying to do this. I'm trying to sell my business in 5 years. It's this exact question. I'm trying to sell my business in 5 years. What can I do today to make sure that I'm maximizing that value?
Can you ground it with, give me an example of a real story? You don't have to give the name of the company. You want to call it ABC Company, and I worked with Bob. Like, what's a real story of a company who you made an impact with, and walk us through that?
There was a business that we worked with. It was call it the food sector, and they were just they basically were mostly a brand. And we told them that, and they had a plant that they actually, it wasn't their primary plant, but they were using that, some of their volume was at that plant. And we sort of ultimately gave them the advice that they were small and they didn't have a lot of control over their margins because a lot of it was tied into that manufacturer that was running. And they had a great brand, but that wasn't quite enough. And so they ended up actually doing a deal before the sale and they acquired that facility. And it was tough. Like it was for a small business and you're just a brand, to get the capital together and to do it, it wasn't super easy, but it definitely paid off for them when they went to sell, because they just had that upper hand. They had that control over their margins. They had de-risked it in a lot of ways because they had control of their supply chain. And actually we're seeing, just on as a side note, like in that, again, food vertical, but whatever, having control of your supply chain has become super important. A lot of even the larger food companies, I deal a lot in the food world, are really looking at that and saying, okay, you have more control over your margins, you have control of when things happen. And if you're beholden to a co-packer or someone else who's doing all your manufacturing, it just adds a risk in there that acquirers don't love.
Thanks for that. That puts a meat on the bone for me.
Yeah.
And when you say control your margins, I don't think there's an entrepreneur out there who wouldn't say, I would love to control my margins. And I think you're speaking their love language. And then I think when you say control the supply chain, it makes me scratch my head and go, how do people control the supply chain? I think a lot of entrepreneurs see the supply chain as out of their control, that they can't do much. They are beholden to the supply chain. Do you have recommendations on how do you go about controlling a supply chain as an aspect of controlling your margin?
It's so in that case that I mentioned, it was more, controlling, going all the way back. So if you think of a food business, it was, can you get a relationship with the farmer? Because if you've got a good relationship with the farmer, they have a concern as well. I was listening to a podcast which had the guy who owns Alinea. It was on, and he was the founder there. He also, anyways, done a bunch of things, but he was talking about this super high-end restaurant. And what Alinea does as a restaurant is they actually sell tickets in advance, which gives them the cash up front. And he said, what can I do with this? What can I do with this cash? And so his perspective was, I'm going to go back to the suppliers and say, if I pay you in advance, can you give me a better deal? Like, well, how much can you drop the margin on what I'm paying you? And it was just revolutionary. Like the supplier was beef supplier, for instance, were just like, what are you talking about? No one's ever done that before. We always pay 30, 60, 90 days. And he said, well, what would you give me? And it was something like half of the rate. And the problem is that him as a farmer, as the producer of the beef of his supplier, they had a big issue because they didn't have a contracted supply either, right? They're in their supply chain. They were worried. They didn't know whether they could, when they had a piece of beef, if they were going to sell it. And so by buying in advance, they basically said, oh, if you're going to give me the money, then I'll go to my supplier, make sure I get the cow, and then have this item for you and lock that up and be able to have predictability around the margin. So to me, it's really that. It's how can you reach in and be helpful to wherever you're getting your product, wherever your supply is coming from, and to figure out their pain points. And so that, again, it doesn't work the same way for every industry, but that's just an example of one where, again, in food that could.
That could probably work for many industries. You think of somebody who does a roofing as a company, and if they went in and said, hey, what if I prepay for X amount before I have the need? What could you do for me? I think that's a great tip or tactic on ability to control margins, is considering a prepay or a contract before you even need that.
Yeah.
As an investment banker, what do you know to be the top 2 or 3 myths about your career, about your role? When the world hears, hey, Greg Martin's an investment banker, what are 2 or 3 myths that you think are worth dispelling maybe about what that means?
Yeah, it's interesting if you do pay attention in some of these movies, like it was American Psycho, there's an investment banker, and Family Man, there's an investment banker in there that Nicolas Cage is one. Anyways, there's lots of examples of investment bankers. I think we get this idea behind us that we're all just super money hungry and driving fancy cars and all that. I drive a van. I don't actually have a very nice car. I'm not flashy. I think there are there's so many bankers out there. There were a lot of investment bankers out there. And a lot of times we are just people who I think, have a lot of relationships that can put things together. So what a lot of times what I do is I'm talking to different people at different companies and trying to see if I can make connections and I can help them by helping each other. And as a business owner, like, that's tough to do because you're not always out there. You're not always out. You don't have the time. You're running your business. And I would say that's the biggest myth, is that you can get a bunch of intelligence from bankers and lean on it, try to see who they're talking to. And we're all not just these, I don't know, high in these big office towers, just I don't know, just working like crazy and making a lot of money. There's bankers of all different kinds out there. There are ones that work on $2 million companies and ones that work on $2 billion companies. And you really got to find your banker, I think, to find the right one.
Got it. Thanks for that. What's the minimum financial acumen that you feel like an entrepreneur should have to really understand what's happening in their business and the finances? Like, what are the standard reports that you would go, wow, I'm shocked. You don't use this. You don't look at this. You don't review that. What are the standards that an entrepreneur should have when it comes to financials that they're looking at and paying attention to?
The key thing, and it is shocking that, like, I've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs that don't like numbers. Like, they don't like finance. It's not their skill. It's not their forte. They do have to, like, you can't not be, but they tend to just, because they don't love it, they don't spend time on it. And to me, though, I think one of the simplest things that every business needs is, and it's probably weekly, it's like a weekly, here are the key metrics of my business. And as hard as that might seem, you can't skip weeks. Like, you have to look at it every week and say, okay, how am I doing? And just having that history, being able to look back at all the past weeks, and maybe that rolls up into a monthly and more annual, but it doesn't matter. As long as you're looking at those numbers and looking at every week, I think it's got to be done. And just doing that allows you to get a handle on your business, because if costs are all of a sudden make a little bit of a spike, or you're missing on your revenue or whatever it might be, you can catch that. And that's super key to running a business. You can notice people stealing from you. You can notice people not showing up. You can notice so much from your business by actually just like keeping those numbers up to date and looking at them every week.
And you said the key metrics, look at them weekly. What are those key metrics that if somebody's listening, they're taking notes? Okay, Greg said, look at key metrics weekly. What am I looking at?
So every business is different. I would say first and foremost, like, you're always looking at your revenue, and you're always looking at your what's probably some sort of net income or just some sort of profitability. And at the very least, do those two. And then depending on your business, if you may be then looking at unit metrics like volumes, or you may be looking at average prices. If you're, again, to use more food, if you're a restaurant, it's what's the average order value, or what's the mix of my sales. So I think now, again, you don't want to get, as an entrepreneur, you don't want to get bombarded. Like, you don't want it, if it's too intense of a report that you have to make every week and it takes someone a day to do it every time, like it might be too much. I think start small, you can add to it, you can look at it, but just tracking something, whatever you can track, I think you need to track, I think is, again, super helpful. So figure out what the key operating metrics of your business and try to track those, but definitely revenue, profitability. You're obviously, I think every founder looks at their cash balance as well fairly often, which is another important one.
That brings up a good question on what frequency should a entrepreneur look at their cash flow and be able to look at cash flow projections? Should they be looking at that weekly, monthly? Is that, hey, every single day, look at where you're at in your cash position? How often should that be monitored?
Yeah, I think weekly is great. I think you need to put in your calendar and just say, okay, I'm going to spend this day of the week at this. I'm going to put an hour to just look at this, make sure the numbers are sound, go around, ask people if I need to ask them about why this or why that. But I think you need to be. I think if you're only doing it once a month, again, depends on the size of your business and how challenging that is. But if you're, honestly, most businesses, and you're the guy in the business, then I think you need to be looking at it weekly.
Yeah, it's funny because when you guys were talking about control supply chain, control margin, I wrote the third one down, which is control cash, because you can't do some of the things we're talking about without it. And ran ourselves into a situation in the past year where revenue was great, net income was great, but cash was a problem because growth takes cash. And Alan Miltz, who was a co-author with Vern Harnish in Scaling Up, the book Scaling Up, he wrote the cash section of that book. And he has a saying that became the saying for our business, which is revenue is vanity, profit is sanity, but cash is king and queen. Because
Yeah.
with cash, you can do some of the things you talked about earlier. You can negotiate with your suppliers, control your supply chain, right? Do a lot of things that can help you drive the business. I'm pretty passionate on that one. That's really a big one that I found as well. And you probably know this too, like the businesses that generate really strong free net cash flow versus those that may be very big, but they don't generate good cash flow and it takes a massive working line of capital or whatever, the valuations change
Yeah,
in terms of what people are willing to pay for it too.
totally.
You know? And so maybe on that note, I'm curious as to what's going on in Canada here. As interest rates have gone up, multiples have gone down. Again, very industry specific. Have you seen those trends? Is the same thing happening in Canada as well in terms of interest rates and multiples in terms of that relationship?
Yeah, certainly like M&A volume overall is down. And I would actually say there's a lack of supply now of companies. Like there's just not as many companies putting themselves up for sale right now. And it actually surprises me because I would have thought that with call it just capital, like growth capital probably coming that much harder to get right now, that there would be some more of that happening. But certainly in certain sectors we're seeing there's just less. And I think what's happening is if you're a stable business, which is more the ones that we deal with, i.e. you're generating cash, you're probably something's happened. The economy's not been quite as good. Something's had your business and your profitability, your cash has gone down a little bit, and it just makes the business not look as saleable, right? You're like, I might as well spend another year, get these margins back up and get my revenue up a little bit more, and then I'll sell. And so we've really been seeing a lot of that in a lot of the different markets, even in Canada.
Yeah. Okay. So let's transition to lifetime at work. My sense of that podcast is you're really talking to entrepreneurs that are working within companies. You talk about the love-hate relationship that sometimes we have with our jobs. Tell me more about that and really what's your goal and mission behind that podcast?
Yeah, it comes from a story. I think I was in my mid 30s, basically, or ish in my mid 30s when I started it. And the idea was that was the conversation I was having. I was having a lot of conversations with my friends, people who, again, my age, saying, is this it? Is this or I've done my job for 10, 15 years, whatever it is. Is this it? Is this what I'm doing? And I think that discussion is really important because a lot of people are having, and a lot of people think about a lot of things. And I figured, let's just record these. Like I'm having these conversations. It'd be cool to just share that with other people. And that's how it started. And it was more for me, my thought was anyways, more of a commentary on this. I'm not trying to sell a consulting services or do anything like that from a career perspective. It was more just that I've gone through all these things in my career and and discovered all these things about myself and about how do you love your job and the ups and downs that come with it. And so I thought, hey, let's put that out there and hopefully help other people going through the same thing. Because I do feel like when you're young, you're coming out of high school, you have to choose a path or at least a direction, and it's hard. Like, how do you do that? So that's really the idea of the podcast. So every week, every episode, I've got a different guest interview style where I'm just trying to dig into their job, why they love it, why they hate it, what they get out of it, the path they took.
Yeah, and I feel very passionately about entrepreneurship, and certainly entrepreneurs take the risks like you took and others where you start something and it works, it doesn't work. You're putting yourself on the ledge. You're putting some of your own capital at work. It's high risk, high reward kind of situation. And there's a lot of people that would prefer to have the medium or low risk, but still have a potential of a high reward through a positive and reinforcing workplace. And I believe as entrepreneurs, and I'd love to hear your take on this, if you're talking to an entrepreneur about what they can do within their culture to make it the best possible workplace for their team members, what would be some of those keys based on your experience?
Yeah, interviewing a bunch of people, I sit there more so and listen to them. And I think one of the things lately I've really been taking away is that a huge part of it is mindset. When you're in an organization, and just whether you love or hate your job or what you get out of it, is a lot in your head. It's your perspective. It's how you are thinking about it. And one of the things though that I also realize is that whoever your boss is, whatever your company is, you as one individual person, especially if that company is somewhat sizable, you're going to have no influence you're not going to change them. You're not going to change your boss, probably. You're not going to change the culture of your organization, probably. You're going to have to deal with it and work within it. We have this tendency to have a break and with our colleagues, complain about our boss or complain about the company or how they did this or that. But really, I think enjoying your job and being within it and enjoying it really comes down to, I think, your mindset there. And working within those parameters that you've given. Your boss is a dick, or he always asks for this and you don't need it, like fine, but how can I get past that and think about, okay, here's what I need to do to make this a good job for me, to have challenges and succeed. How can I do a good job and perform? Sometimes you do. Sometimes you have to leave your job. That it happens. But if you can try to work with what you've got, it's the best place to start. And a lot of that just comes into, I think, accepting that you may not be able to change your company or your boss.
What are some of the tools that you've used to work on your mindset?
Honestly, I had to do it the hard way. Like, I had to leave the world of investment banking, go be an entrepreneur, and come back to realize that's how I did it. And it just changed my perspective. When I came back, I was like, you guys make money. It's consistent. You built this business up. You've got dependable client. Like, it was a different business. And so that, honestly, that's what I've done. I do find that it's hard to listen to a podcast and someone say something and all of a sudden you to have this epiphany moment. Like, when you listen to too much podcast to really do that, it sometimes just takes this huge push, this huge something, this huge awakening of your, oh my God, like I can't. And I've had a number of those moments over my career. And it's those where you're left being like, this can't be it. There has to be more. There has to be a different way. I need to search. And I think it's when you go on a journey like that out there that you really find and you really can start to do those things. So I guess what I'd say, and the advice I'd give is just like, look for that. Look for those signs. Those signs are good. They happen to everyone. And doesn't mean you have to quit your job or buy a Porsche or whatever we do when we have a crisis. It could just mean that you need to reevaluate your perspective and how you're approaching work.
As we look to close the conversation, what is one piece of actionable advice that entrepreneurs should take, say, over the course of the next week after having listened to you?
Yeah, I'd say like a nice, easy, small one is, and I'm big on, didn't talk about it a ton, but I think it ties into it, is just priorities. It's just figuring out what your priorities are, whether you are an entrepreneur or whether you're in a company, and just figuring out what do I really want to do with my days and what do I really want to prioritize. And so I'm big on just the lists. I love a list. It's super simple, but it's what do I want to focus my time on? What do I want to spend my day doing? Just a good list like that. And just put it in a place that you'll come across. It could be somewhere where you'll see it, whether it's in a folder on your computer where you'll see it, or whether it's on your door of your office, whatever it is. And just put it in a place where you can reference it or come across it or see it, and just have sight of those priorities, those goals. I think that becomes key, because I noticed it for sure when I was an entrepreneur. Your to-do list is endless, and you oftentimes, I think, lose sight of what you're really trying to do all the time and what you're really trying to be and how you're trying to spend your day. And really that's what's important.
Greg, thanks for joining us for the conversation today.
Thanks for having me.
Please stick around for a few more minutes while Rich and I break down this episode. Rich, I'll give you one really good example. Amy, my wife, used to work at Campbell's Soup. Do you know that Campbell's Soup literally takes the tomatoes from the farm right to their factory into all the, I don't even know what they're called, valves or whatever in the factory to make the soup? They control the supply chain from A to Z. And not a lot of companies can do that, but when you get to a certain scale and size, you can. I love the idea of thinking through what are those partners or suppliers or vendors you use to produce your business, and how can you form better relationships with them? Sometimes it's not just prepaying. Sometimes you develop strong relationships. You do volume deals with them. Prepayment's certainly a method. But when you guys were talking through the supply chain and talking about food, it brought me back to that Campbell Soup example, where they literally own the farms where the tomatoes come from to make tomato soup. That's how you fully control it. Very hard for a lot of companies to do that, because you don't necessarily want to go downstream and say, oh, since we're in the food business, let's go start buying cows and having our own farm for that. So not very easy for small to medium-sized businesses to do that, but managing your supply chain in a very tight manner and building strong relationships there is critical to success and critical to driving the right margins for your business.
I know supply chains aren't new and they've always been important. We really haven't had many guests mention them until after the pandemic.
True. And
when supply chain restriction and supply chains became an issue for people to be able to get the products that their very livelihood, their very business depends on, and it became an issue, all of a sudden, this became a much bigger topic on controlling supply chains. I know for our business in doing painting, paint was difficult to come by. And the very large manufacturers of paint, they were having a hard time having the paint be made because their supply chain on getting the chemicals was choked. to the point where there are some paint manufacturers that are looking to have plants that actually now create their own chemicals so that they then are not reliant on their supply chain. It just becomes a bigger and bigger deal, particularly when they're constricted, the supply chains, and it forces people to be a little more creative, to your point, like Campbell's Soup going to the farmer is a good example of it.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing that we talked about here that I didn't get a chance to double back on, but he talked about sometimes taking a few kicks at the can before you go sell your business. I think that's a really good exercise. I've had experience in that, where you're thinking, yeah, maybe now's a good time to sell your business, and you go put a book out on the business, you hire an investment banker, you go through the process, and it may not work the first time, but the valuable lessons you learn by having people evaluate your business and literally put a number on paper for what it's worth and why it's only worth this much. Here are the 3 or 4 or 5 things that you don't have licked, and therefore I'm lowering the value of your company because of, and taking those 4 or 5 things and making them your priorities, putting them on your list of things to get done for your organization is a very good thing to do. A lot of entrepreneurs think, I'm going to sell my business in 5 or 6 years or 10 years or whatever it may be, but they're not really sure what are the key metrics they need to achieve to increase their valuation. And I think it's really important. I would encourage every single entrepreneur, regardless if you're thinking about selling your business in the next couple of years or a decade from now, go meet with an investment banker, have them really look inside the guts of your business and provide you an evaluation of, look, here are 3 or 4 areas that are going to hold back your multiple or the valuation of this business. It's a fantastic exercise and can really mean a big difference from a dollars and cents perspective down the road.
You asked him about his podcast, and it was about enjoying your work and how to get the most out of your work. And what we heard from him was your mindset really matters. You can't change your boss or the culture. You have to deal with what you have and have a good mindset about it. What that reminded me of is a cousin of mine who does some work for Boeing. She's an aerospace engineer. And she had said at one point she thought that she could change the world. And what she realized in her job at Boeing was she was not able to change the world, but where she was empowered was she can change the world around her. Mm. And that really resonated for me when she said that to me. And I'm reminded of that from what Greg had said, that you can't change your culture in the company, but you could change the culture around you. You could change the culture from the people who you lead through all of the others. Occasionally, yes, you can influence up. Rarely can you change your boss. That's why they're in the position of authority. But you can, I think, change your culture around you. And we could change the world around us, even though we may not be able to change the world at large.
Yeah, it's a big macro look. It is somewhat disheartening, right? When you hear, maybe you can't change your culture and you can't change your boss and therefore deal with it and have the right mindset and perspective. And it makes me sad for the state of leadership that people are in leadership positions and create cultures that are not welcoming to everybody there and not ones that they're open to feedback and change and evolving with their teams. That's a whole different podcast episode on its own. But that's one of those things that struck me in this one too, is in order for someone to have fulfillment in their life, it's interesting. I would have maybe a different message to give to people than Greg's a little bit, but maybe I'm not as aware. I'd be like, look, if you're not happy with where you're at, the culture or your boss, leave and go somewhere where you are going to have passion behind what you're doing, because that's why we live, is to have passion for what we're doing. I realize that's easier said than done, and not everybody can just leave their job if they don't like, their job or their boss. But it just makes me think that, there's such a big opportunity for leaders to step up, to make those small changes that you talked about so you can impact the world around you.